Hi, welcome back. In the previous video, we saw how we could create basic routes using the framework. In this part of the video, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into the concept of routes, and we are going to see how we could create some more complex routing in this framework. We're going to learn really two things. The first one is going to be how we could create parameterized routes, which means we could add some variables to it that we can later on fetch. And second, we're going to learn how we could hand off some of the logic. Instead of it being in the web.php file, we could hand it off to a separate controller class. We are going to dig further into controllers at some point in a separate video tutorial, so I do not want you to panic if there are certain things about the controllers that you do not understand. Don't worry, we will get to a point where we will have a completely dedicated section for it. With that said, let's go back to our editor. You might see a little bit of changes here and there in the code, but again, I don't want you to worry. There is nothing that I mentioned in the previous video that is not in here, or vice versa. And if there are some changes, I will point them out to you. But nothing in between videos is going to be done, and that it's not live. Okay, so this is almost the same kind of content that we had in the previous video. I went back and changed these initial routes to the out-of-the-box statements that were given to us. There is no worry there. We're gonna anyway go ahead and change these all over again. So let's get started. What we want to do first is we are going to try and define routes that have parameters in them. So what does this mean? This means that if I go to the browser to show you, if a user is to type in something like localhost slash posters, for instance, slash 1 or slash 2 or slash 3, etc. If what this means, or what we want to define with this, is to have this last component be a parameterized item, which means it could be anything, and that we want to fetch into a variable once we take it on to the controller. So how do we do this in our code? And there is a very neat way to do it in Calligraphy, which we will get to. So at first we call in the class route, and in the class route we are still working with the get methods. So we are going to say that when it's the root, and at the root level we are going to pass a variable. So how do we pass a variable? What we say is we put it in brackets or in accolades, whichever way you call that. So in between accolades, this is how we define a variable, and we're going to name that variable. So let's say, for the sake of the conversation, we're going to call it ID. Why? Because we want to get a particular poster, for that matter, that has a certain ID, whatever the user ends up typing in the browser. Great. So now that we have this, we're just gonna echo so we're gonna do a callback function in here, and we are going to echo this is the path to the ID. Okay, I'm just doing a simple string here just to test it out with you. So now if I go to the browser and I do slash posters, obviously it will take anything at this stage. It would take the 2, it would take the 3, and so on and so forth. Now, in order to make this a little more powerful, I'd like you to remember what we covered in the first video, and that is we always need the root defined. Okay, why? Because the root is always going to be the fallback in case it doesn't know, or it's not able to match the URI that the user entered with anything that is defined in our routes, which is totally our case. So we always need, and keep that in mind, to add a route, which is our fallback route that goes back always to the root, and we're going to say this is our root, okay, our root. So now if I go back here and I type in /3/2, which is not defined anywhere, it's going to take me to the root always, okay? When I do /3, it's going to tell me this is the path to the ID. All right, so all this is great, but how can we benefit and use this variable, you know, in a more practical way, because there's not much we could do with it. And in order for us to do this, we need to understand that most of the logic in calligraphy, if we want to benefit out of all the core helpers, out of all the class methods that we have, it needs to be in the context of a controller. So a controller, instead of writing the code, a bunch of code directly in this file, it is a separate class on its own that is defined in the application structure, and where you could put any form of logic that you need and that your application needs. So how do we call a controller from here? And in fact, it's very, very easy, okay? So what we could do is just call the controller name. So let's create a controller together, and I will show you how to do that. And let's give it a name just for the purpose of this video. Let's call it the poster controller, okay? And we're going to save that. And that's all I need to give. I just need to give a string, which is the name of the controller. But so far, we don't have the controller yet. So we're going to go into the controller section. We're going to create a new file. Okay, and nothing prevents you, by the way, from creating a separate folder. So maybe let's do that. Let's create a separate folder, call it posters, which is our posters application. Let's make it capital just for the sake of it, okay? And then inside of that folder, let's create the poster controller. And it needs to be a PHP file. Great. So now that I am in this completely empty file, it is definitely a PHP, so don't forget to open the tags. And then we're going to say it is a class, and it's always a class. We're going to call it poster controller. And every controller in Calligraphy needs to extend the main controller class that is defined in our framework. So if we go to framework in here and we look at the core classes, you will find a controller class in here. And every controller within Calligraphy needs to extend that controller, because it gives you certain methods out of the box that would save you a lot of time. Now, within this controller, every logic needs to be scoped within a function of that controller. Okay. Now, from the route, if I go back to the route, we have not defined any action or any function or any method that is to be called from within this controller. Why is that? At some point, I'm going to show you how to do it, how we can target specific action and methods from the poster controller class. But there is always an implied one that the server or that Calligraphy knows about, and that is the index method. So from the moment you call a function here that is called index, okay, the logic can go into index when you do not want to target a specific method from within the controller. Okay, and you don't need to define anything else in the route. Everything will be read from the index function. Great. So let me echo the same statement that we echoed earlier, and we are going to say this is the path to ID, and we'll go test it. So let's go back in here. We're calling the poster controller, and since we have not defined anything else but the class name, it's going to read anything that's within the index method. So now let's go back in here, and ideally we should see exactly the same thing, which is exactly this is the path to ID. So we succeeded in passing from the route to the controller, and now this is our playground, and we can explore all the great functionalities that come with the controller. What we want to do in here in particular, we do want to read the ID, and I will show you this in a while. But before that, I do want to show you how we can target specific functions within a controller. So let's create another function in here, and let's call it read all. Okay, or read, just simply read, which is about reading the information of that particular ID. And let's echo this is the read function. So now how can I target this read function from the routing? What I need to do is, and I'm going to create another one over here. I'm going to call it get/id. It's a variable. Okay, and let's call it read. Okay, so that path would be defined, and then we're going to call the controller name. But what we're going to do, we're going to add an @ and we're going to add the name of the function, which happens to be read. And this should take us to this method, and it should echo this is the read function. So let's try that. If I do /3/read, this is the read function. So we were able, from the route, to target a particular method from within the controller. Great. Now let's go back and let's see how we can get the value of that ID that is given in the browser. Okay, because we don't know. All the route is doing is it's fetching this and it's saying that the path that the user entered or the URI that the user entered matches one of the routes that is defined based on the pattern that was given to it. But it doesn't know yet what value this is. And in order to get that value, what we need to do is we need to be able to read the request. Okay, so there is another concept on its own that is the request class, and that is within the framework. And this request class has several methods in it that can be found and can be taken from the documentation that we have. So if you go back to the documentation, there is a request section, and within that request section there is a set of properties and methods from within this class that are accessible to the controller and can be called from the controller, and we could use all these properties and methods, which is, you know, a handful, a small list, but it has a lot of value. And then let's explore some of these methods in here, and I will show you how we could extract the ID from the request. Now let me go back a little bit to the code, and let's take a look at the controller methods. Why is it important to take a look at the controller methods? Because everything that is happening in here is a controller and is of type controller. So all the methods that are available in controller are also available to us at the poster controller level. Okay, and we need to learn and master these methods in order for us to be fluent in the code. So if we go back to the documentation, we can also see in here that we have a section called controllers, and within that section there's a lot of explanation on how to create it, how to route the controllers, so feel free to read them. But there is something called controller methods, and over here we have a list of all the methods that this controller has, and there's also a list of properties that this controller has. And notice that one of the properties is the request. So from within the controller, there is a property that points to the request class, and that allows us to use the request methods and the request properties from within the controller itself. So how do we do this? So all we know is we definitely need to access the request, and we ultimately we need to get the ID in a variable. So how do we do this? What we're going to say .this to point to the controller. So what we're going to do is we're going to call a method or a property that is a request. Okay, why? Because this controller has a request property, and this request property is of type request. So we can call any method from the request directly like this. And in this particular case, what we want to do is we want to fetch, okay, from the request. And what do we want to fetch? We want to fetch the variable name that we passed in the route, which happens to be ID. It's as simple as this. So now let's echo ID, and let's see what this gives us. So if I go back here and I do poster/3, it's giving me my 3. If I do poster/hello, it's giving me my hello. So just with this simple statement, we were able to fetch the ID. Now there is a slightly different syntax to this that also can be used. Let's call it ID2. We're going to say it's the exact same thing. It's request, but instead of fetching it in parentheses like this, what we're going to do is we're going to say fetch ID. Okay, why? Because it's also represented as a collection or as an object literal, and we can access any variable name that we define in the route as if it's a property of an object. So now let's echo ID2 instead, and ideally we should see exactly the same result. So if I say great, it will give me great. So voila, in this particular case we learned how to pass an argument or to pass a variable to the controller and to read it from there, which if you think about is a great step that we have. Something else that I want to show you, these variables can be cascaded in multiple different ways. Okay, so it's not about just having one variable. We could have several variables cascaded. So I could say I want to do the ID and I want to do the name. Okay, and if I go back here now, instead of ID2, let's go grab the name. We're going to say this request and we're going to fetch the name, and what we're going to echo the ID. I'll put like a dash in here, and then we're going to echo the name. And now if I go back, now my route this should not work anymore. Exactly. Sorry for that. So it should say great slash name. And now we have great dash name. Okay? Now, you notice that when I do just great, since the path is not defined, it's going to create some form of an error. So it's always good over here to check whether this function worked or not to echo a value. So the way to do this, we could use some of the interesting syntax in PHP, which is going to say if this function works, then return it. If it doesn't work, then return empty. Okay, and we're going to do the same thing with name. If it worked, if it didn't work, then return empty. And now ideally this should eliminate our error. Okay, because we don't have a name in this case, then it's going to return an empty. If I have a 2, then it's going to return a 2. So this explains a little bit how we could use the request function. Let's go back and take a look at other request methods that can be useful to us. Okay, it's always good in every situation to actually echo out what each method or what each property is giving us. This is a great way to learn how the framework works. But here are some other interesting properties or methods that we could use. So we learned about fetch today. You can either use fetch argument, or you could use the property fetch and then retrieve an object attribute directly from there as defined in your route. There are others such as parameters or such as files, which we will learn more about once we start working on post on the post HTTP methods. So those are great ways to get all the parameters of a post. So in order to do that, you will use the parameters method. And if you want to get any files that you allow your users to upload, then in that case you will be able to read them through this method, which will return all the files that were posted by the user. Now there are other properties in here that can be very helpful as well. In many cases you would probably want to get the URI that the user entered, the way they entered it. So in order to do that, you probably let's maybe echo that URI in here. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna say this request URI, and let's take a look at what this does for us. It's gonna give us great/2. Let me clean this up a little bit for you. So let's get rid of that one for the time being. And anything that you enter in here /3/4, yes, well, in that case it's not defined. But if I do great/hello, it really reads the URI that is entered after the root. Okay, so now this can be helpful. In many cases you would want to check where, for example, or from which URI, this function has been called. This is a good way to do it. If we go back to the documentation, so there are other ones such as cookies. If you're using cookies and you want to retrieve them from the header, if you want to know what HTTP method is used, then you could use the method property. Let's take a look at this one as well. So if I do this method, then in that case it's going to return the get method. Okay, if it happens to be a post, then it's going to return a post, and if it happens to be somehow a put or a delete, then it will also return the appropriate one for us. So this sort of summarizes a little bit. So what we've done in this video is we learned how to call a controller directly from the routes, which is an important step in this process. And then we learned how to create parameterized URIs or parameterized routes, and then we learned how to read them from the controller. This alone is a big step in the framework world, and now from this point on, creating logic or creating some interesting application can very much happen at any time from starting from this video. In the next video, we're gonna check out how to create models and controllers. Now we're getting slightly deeper into what this framework is capable of doing. There is no way for us to be able to do some significant examples without us having to create models and controllers. Okay, we can definitely play around and create different sorts of controllers, but we do want to concentrate first on the logic side of things before we start seeing how to create views. Okay, so in that order, we're going to start by playing around with models and controllers, and then after this we're going to look at the UI side of things, and we are going to see how we can create views for what we create. Thank you very much for watching, and we look forward to our next video.